4 years after the Galwan incident, when 20 Indian soldiers were killed at the line of actual control, India and China have now reached an agreement on disengagement at the two remaining holdout points, Depsang Valley and Demchok. Now, the foreign minister and the foreign secretary both have confirmed that a patrolling arrangement has also been arrived at. So the question, which is critical and which needs to be answered, is are we back to the pre-2020 status quo? So let me ask Professor Victor Gao, we are still awaiting the details of what is the nature of the patrolling. We're also awaiting the details of how the disengagement happened in the two last remaining holdouts, which were Depsang and Demchok. But as we await those details, the big picture is that for the last 5 years, India and China have not had a bilateral at the highest level, at the level of the two principals. For the last 4 years, this is not a normal relationship. As the External Affairs Minister said time and time again, this is not a normal relationship. And you cannot go back to normal until you fix the border. Is this a sign that we are returning to normal? And to that extent, India held out for 4 years saying that you cannot unilaterally change the status quo. So are we to believe, Professor Gao, that China has finally relented and said, okay, we'll go back to the arrangement that served us well for 30 years. We will go back to how it existed prior to June of 2020.
Thank you very much for having me. First of all, let us congratulate the Chinese government and the Indian government for having reached this agreement, which in itself is a very important one, because for China and India, the two largest populations in the world, each having population larger than 1.4 billion people, for us to be kind of distracted by the border dispute is a shame for both countries. We need to really promote cooperation between these two countries, especially because both China and India are important members of the BRICS organization, and each of us have huge responsibility for domestic economic development, lifting people out of poverty, and China has already achieved that in 2020. India still has a long way to go in achieving this end. So for the two countries to agree how to better management the patrol exercise going forward is absolutely the right thing and a very important development. Now, allow me to mention one thing. I understand over the past 4 or 5 years, there was one big country which wants to urge China and India to be more contentious against each other. Whereas there is another big country, Russia, which has made the point to both China and India that for whatever reason, China and India should have the courage and the wisdom to overcome the problems. And I think the latter, a big country, was doing the right thing, and the former big country was doing the wrong thing.
But Professor Gao, here the contention is that you are giving too much credit to what you have just said are the machinations of the United States, and too much to the peace brokering efforts by Russia. Ultimately, the reason why the situation was abnormal between China and India was because China decided to unilaterally attack Indian soldiers in Galwan. 20 Indian soldiers died. And there were these 7 friction points where China unilaterally disregarded long-held military agreements from 1993 and 1996, unilaterally disregarded that and changed the status quo. And no matter, big power, persuasion or machination is not going to change that reality. Today, if we are saying that we're going back to pre-2020, then it means that the reality on the ground has gone back to pre-2020. It's not going to go back because America said so or Russia nudged both countries to do so.
Now, first of all, between China and India, we should have enough capabilities to solve whatever problems there are between the two of us. However, if India is played by another big country, that may change the equilibrium. And if another country, Russia, wants to play a different role, of course it will be helpful if you have the peace of mind to look at this kind of more conciliatory tone played by the role of Russia. Now, aside from that, allow me to mention, in due respect to all the Indian panelists, and including you, I think your representation and the Chinese position are seemingly in parallel universe. Because from the Chinese perspective, it is the Indian forces on the ground which have kept pushing beyond the line of actual control, setting up camps, setting up permanent structures, for example, forcing China to take action to retaliate against
that is not true. That is not true. I'm hearing for the first time that you're saying, or you're characterizing what happened in June 2020 as some kind of a retaliation. There was no attack from the Indian side in 2020 for any kind of retaliation. The moot point is that China has bitten off more than it can chew. It has ongoing territorial disputes with Japan, South Korea. There is, of course, Taiwan. All of the stuff that's happening in the South China Sea. There are boats literally colliding every week off the coast of the Philippines. China has realized that it can't open so many fronts, and therefore, if there is a front vis-a-vis India where it can quietly, tone down the temperature, then so be it. And maybe you're right. Maybe it's come at a little bit of nudge and wink from our friends in Moscow.
Now, allow me to mention one thing. China definitely wants to have good relations with India. We highly admire the Indian people, your civilization, etc. So I think both China and India need to work very hard to put these territorial disputes behind us, rather than being hijacked by these disputes. Now, secondly, for sure, China has altogether 14 land neighboring countries. China signed a land border treaty with 12 of them. Only India and Bhutan have not yet signed the border treaties with China. And you mentioned Bhutan. China and Bhutan seem to be very eager to move forward to solve all their territorial disputes. Okay. If they can do that, why should that be a detriment to India? India should welcome China and Bhutan.
But India has legitimate security concerns around that area which is disputed between Bhutan and China. That's why India should be concerned, and India has legitimate stakes there. I mean, if nothing else, it's incumbent upon the Indian army to provide protection to Bhutanese sovereignty, as we saw in 2017 in Doklam. We'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Like I said, the details are still not been made public. I guess we'll get to know when that meeting happens. It's very likely that there will be a standalone sort of meeting bilateral between Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi on the sidelines of the BRICS summit in Kazan.